Hello, I'm Dr. Anthony Clark, and I'm a professor of Chinese history. And this series is about the Catholic martyr saints of China. This particular episode is about the Jesuit martyr saints who died in China during the Boxer Uprising. And today I'm joined with my good friend and also a Jesuit priest, Father Paul Mariani. So thank you, Father Paul.
Thank you very much.
And he'll be talking about the Jesuit martyr saints, but I should also say that Father Mariani is a specialist of the history of the Catholic Church in China during the Maoist period, and he just finished a book about the 1950s and Catholic resistance in Shanghai, so we'll look for that. But thank you very much for being with me today.
Thank you.
Father, as a Jesuit, you're particularly, I think, qualified to talk about the Jesuits, and we've mentioned in an earlier episode that the Jesuits really were the beginning of a great mission, and starting with Matteo Ricci. So I wonder if you could just, before we talk about the martyrs,
Sure.
Could you say something about the Jesuit mission in China in general to kind of set the stage?
Sure. I would say that the Jesuit mission in China was the first Roman Catholic effort to missionize, to evangelize China in the early modern period. Before that, there were two other attempts. Nestorian Christians had been active, then the Franciscans in about the 13th century. But what had happened, in a sense, those missions had collapsed over the span of time and different invasions and such. So around the 1550s, St. Ignatius of Loyola, Spanish nobleman of birth, decided to put his past behind him and devote wholeheartedly for God. And in this period, he had these long periods of prayer, and he decided slowly, decided to gather a group of men around him, which eventually turned into the Jesuits, the Society of Jesus. While he's studying in Rome, he's a bit older, he's gone back to school, he meets a young man, Francis Xavier, and they become good friends, companions, roommates, even despite the bit of an age gap. So from the very beginning, I think Ignatius of Loyola saw something in Francis Xavier, kind of your typical college student in a sense, and yet something, don't we often find in people, there's something below the surface that is kind of dynamic, maybe explosive, and if it's directed right, can do great wonders for the church. So ultimately, in fact, Francis Xavier was not at the top of the list to be sent to the Indies or abroad, but he comes to that position, and he's the first Jesuit missionary to go to the Far East. In fact, he goes to India, he goes through Indonesia, and he spends year after year, and then he finally goes to Japan, one of the first Europeans to ever make it to Japan, probably within 10 years of first European contact with Japan. While he's in Japan, they say, well, if your religion is so well known or so important, how come we haven't heard about it from China? See, China had been transmitting for centuries their greatest art, philosophy, poetry to Japan. So Francis Xavier, ever the missionary, says, well, okay, good enough. I'll go to China, probably having no sense of what he's getting into or the vast distances. In fact, he writes one letter, he says, to Ignatius of Loyola, and of course these letters were not like text messaging today. They would take a year or more to get to Europe and a year back. He says, if you can't find me in Canton, look for me in this city called Peking. No idea of the distances, but so ever the missionary. Now the story is he goes just off the coast. He goes back through Macau and that region, and he's just off the coast of China. The problem is China is barred to foreigners. If you're a foreigner, you won't probably be executed, but you'll be kindly escorted back out of the Middle Kingdom. It doesn't bother him. He still wants to get in. The trouble is he can't get people to ferry him in. So he's kind of through fatigue, missionary fatigue after long years of labor, dies just off the coast of China in 1552. So that brings Francis Xavier, in a sense, a failed China mission, but his dreams lived on. A great missionary, but in terms of China, never able to set his foot into the continent. This is kind of important because 1552, he dies the same exact year, probably the second most famous Jesuit missionary in China, Matteo Ricci, from a town called Macerata. In fact, this year we celebrated the 400th anniversary of his death. So Matteo Ricci goes to China, and by 1582 he actually is able to go into the mainland. His approach is a little different. He realizes he's dealing with a culture with a great long history of philosophy, arts, and culture. So he first sets his mind to doing what? Learning that language, which we know is not the easiest language to kind of even get a handle on. Not only does he learn it, but he learns the literary form. So he's able to translate prayers, books, and he meets with some of the high officials, and he kind of embarks on a top-down approach. He realizes that his goal is to try to get to the emperor and make the emperor friendly to Christianity, and maybe even find a new Constantine to kind of help convert the whole Chinese empire. So those are the two key first Jesuit missionaries, the first most well-known Jesuit missionaries in China. St. Francis Xavier, a canonized saint for hundreds of years, and Matteo Ricci as well.
Is there anything special about the Jesuit approach to missions other than this accommodation? Or could you say a little more about the accommodationist approach?
Sure. A number of, from the earliest days, Jesuits have had a number of approaches, but it seemed to be that there was one approach from some other religious orders, which of course made sense in certain contexts of basically you just go into the village plazas or marketplaces, you carry high your crucifix, and you call people to the gospel. In some cases, you destroy their idols, or it's kind of an antagonistic relationship with the local culture. Matteo Ricci realized that this push to an extreme in China would quickly get them invited back out of China. So there didn't seem to be a way forward. So he decided to kind of embark on a way of trying to find commonalities. Where was the Christian message different from the Chinese message, and where were there some similarities? How was God already working in the Chinese context for which Jesus Christ would sort of be a capstone or the fulfillment of what was already in their hearts? This was Ricci's project.
So I think this is a really important thing to remember when we think about the Jesuit mission in general, this accommodationist approach, this really rich early history starting with St. Francis Xavier and Matteo Ricci. But certainly things weren't all rosy in China, and by 1900 we have what we call the Boxer Rebellion, and certainly we know that there were an awful lot of martyrs that died during the Boxer Rebellion. And I wonder if you could say maybe a little bit about the Boxer Rebellion, and then a little bit about the Jesuit martyrs. There were two different villages where the Jesuits were martyred in. One was Wuyi, and one was this village called Zhujiahe. So if you could tell us something about the Boxer Rebellion, and then maybe something about the first two Jesuit martyrs who died in China.
Very good. What I would say is the goal of the missionary really is to preach Jesus in season and out of season. And it's very interesting for the Jesuit mission. The Jesuit mission in China had already lasted, say, 250 years. And then what happened through, there were some serious problems within the church. Some attempts by the Jesuits to inculcate the liturgy were kind of stopped through the Chinese rites. The Jesuit order itself was suppressed. So when they were reconstituted in the early 1800s, there was kind of a second major chapter of missionary activity in China. The first one, Europeans were very much maybe the junior partner. They were really trying their best to preach the gospel in a very ancient civilization. When they came the second time, Europe was definitely on the ascent, and this we cannot deny. And in fact, China was kind of forced into an inferior role. The fact was, missionaries kind of had to go with that baggage. In some cases, they could afford their Christians sort of protection, and in other cases, in the earlier period, they could not. So by 1900, you kind of had this cauldron of activity. The North China Plain, where these Jesuits had gone back to, was southeast of the city of Beijing, the northern capital of China. And they were given this mission. They were truly missionaries. So the fact was they were given missions. And the Jesuits from Paris went to the Shanghai region, and the Jesuits from the Champagne northern region of France went to this area southeast of Beijing. Now you ask about the Boxer Rebellion. Well, it's like you say, it's kind of a complex and messy history, but there had been it was kind of like the wild, wild west, as we would say, the North China Plain, except that there was a heavy, very dense population in northern China, limited resources, constant droughts, famines, floods, etc. So people lived a precarious existence. The idea of the missionary was not only to feed their flocks spiritually, but protect them as well from bandits, from the ravages of troops coming through, and to make sure that they were well fed as all. So this was, in that sense, they were very good pastors. What happened in the Boxer Rebellion was still we have to understand that the Catholic Church, the Christians in China, was still a tiny, tiny flock. So the fact was, most of their neighbors were non-Christians, who in most cases they got along well with. However, over time, there began to be more and more resentment, especially over things that they could not control. And in a sense, the foreigners became a bit of a scapegoat. So the Boxer Rebellion was anti-foreign and it was anti-Christian, but it was a mixed bag. Some cases it was purely political, some cases religious. But the fact was, these Boxers went after Christians, not only foreign missionaries, but also local Christians as well.
So at Wuyi, this village, there were two martyrs I recall. One was named Izure, and the other was Andlauer. Can you tell us something about their stories?
Right. They were from France, the northern part of France, and went through the normal Jesuit seminary formation. And at one point, what they would do is express their desire to go to the missions. In fact, if you go to some of the mission archives in Rome, you'll see row after row of what they call the Indipitae, letters written by Jesuit seminarians or from other orders saying, please send me to the missions. Mm-hmm. Again, the next year, please send me to the missions. Again, the next year, please send me to the missions. And then they would go back to their work, teaching in the high schools, working in parishes, and then one day that call might come from their provincial saying, yes, you are going to hold your breath. It could be anywhere, Africa, Madagascar, Southeast Asia, China. Mm-hmm. And that was often the dream. China held a kind of a special pride of place, a fascination for Jesuits for centuries. So these Jesuits worked in the North China Plain, southeast of Beijing, and they were basically they sought converts. They were missionaries in the kind of truest, purest sense of not simply kind of staffing institutions, but doing firsthand evangelization, seeking converts, and also taking care of them after they had become Catholic. So there they are. The Boxers are encircling the town, and Wuyi was not very well defended. So you have to understand that, like I say, the Wild West, not only Catholics, but others had kind of fortified themselves in these villages. And Wuyi was not very well fortified. So when the Boxers came, the two priests there that were Christians left, and they pretty much just waited for their death. And they, in fact, were martyred by the Boxers.
Yeah, isn't there some story about what they were doing while the Boxers approached Saint Izure and Saint Andlauer?
Right. The story is that they were, they had given the sacraments to their flock, but pretty much they were praying and waiting for their own death.
Yeah. And that's certainly a compelling story. But I think the most dramatic, in fact, one of the most dramatic stories of the Boxer Rebellion is related to the death of two other Jesuit saints, martyr saints of China, Saint Paul Den and Saint Leon Manzhan, who died in the village of Zhujiahe. I wonder if you could tell us that story.
Right, the story of Zhujiahe is very fascinating and compelling, from which we basically get at least 4 martyr saints that are officially recognized by the Roman Catholic Church. Fathers Manzhan, Leo Ignace Manzhan, Fathers Den, and then 2 local Christians, Mary Chu and Z.H. Zhu, Mary Zhu, and also Peter Zhu. Mm-hmm. And what I would say in this case was, as I had said, the local Christians knew the Boxers were coming over some periods of months. In fact, word came to the Zhujiahe mission, Zhujiahe basically meaning the river where the Zhu family, Z.H. Zhu family, reside. So basically, these were clans or Catholic clans, meaning these were kinship networks, brothers, uncles, sisters, extended in-laws, all kind of living together, and other people in the village might be somewhat distantly related. So they were all kind of in these walled compounds, and Zhujiahe was pretty well defended, not as well as some of the major towns, but pretty well defended. And the story is they got news of what had happened in Wuyi, that the 2 priests had been killed there. And we know some of this through eyewitness accounts that were recorded later, but also because Father Manzhan was also writing letters at this time, kind of a blow-by-blow account before his own martyrdom. He is writing saying, I have heard that 2 priests in a nearby village have been killed, and it seems to be those 2 that we had just mentioned. So the fact is, we don't know if this could have been avoided, but I remember you showing me that kind of horrific image of the bones, the skeletal remains of hundreds, 1,000 or more Catholics in this one church that went up in flames through the Boxer activity. That's a fact. That's a historical fact. A massacre, really, of which 4 of those saints, probably 4 of those skeletal remains there are martyrs that we have spoken of. So basically, you asked me about the story, and the Boxers were circling. At the same time, the Qing Imperial Army is on its way north to protect itself against the foreign incursions. Now, I'm not talking Star Wars or something here, but the Imperial Army, just a year before, this is kind of the luck of a political activity, just a year before had protected these Catholic villages, in fact, all of the villages, from the Boxers, who they saw basically as bandits. Then the Empress Dowager of China kind of switched sides and threw her lot in with the Boxers, which of course enraged the foreign Western powers. So at that time, the Boxers and the National Army link up. And still, a crisis could have been avoided, except that at that point, this one particular Qing imperial officer was headed north. He sends a scout to find out if these Catholics are really that bad, or if these Christians in this village are really that bad. Well, given the state, they actually kill him. So they kill the scout. And once the scout is killed, they send the army back in. And then it's kind of like a last-ditch effort to basically eradicate that town, the Boxers and the army. And that's why we get such horrific numbers, thousands of deaths. The Christians in that village had defended themselves by arms, others through the arms of prayer, pretty much. But it was pretty much a foregone conclusion. After some hours, the 2 men had dispensed the sacraments, had ministered to their flocks, and basically there was no hope at the end. They were killed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and one aspect of this story that you and I have discussed before that I think is just very moving, and that is that really in the last hours of the attack on this village at Zhujiahe, the 2 priests, the 2 martyr saints, the 2 Jesuit priests, were actually inside of the church. Right. With about maybe 1,000 or more of Catholic faithful as the Boxers attacked. And what happened to them in those last few hours?
Right. I would say that, who likes waiting? But imagine waiting for your death. It's one thing if it's only minutes or say 20 minutes, but they were there for hours. And they realized that the Boxers and the Imperial Army were enclosing around them. So they basically, vested. They could not say Mass at that time, but they had vested, waited, heard confessions, and kind of consoled the faithful. Meanwhile, they could hear constantly the encroaching number of Boxers. Yeah. In fact, when the Vatican looks at what makes a martyr saint, there are usually 3 major conditions. One is the fact that they have to be murdered, they have to be killed for martyrdom, but also that the person who is martyred has to have an awareness that their actions could bring about martyrdom, that it's not just haphazard or accidental or by the way, that it's a conscious decision to take a stance for their own faith. And thirdly, there has to be an awareness on the part of the persecutor that they're not just doing this for political reasons or something, but they are doing this in odium fide, that is, in hatred of the faith, that there is a clear sense in which they hate the Christian religion, they hate Jesus or what he stands for, and they want to murder these missionaries. So once you have those 3 conditions, any one of them lacking, the case is weakened. But those 3 conditions, and I think in this case, we clearly have a case. We could say other Christians, well, they were fighting in self-defense, which was, I think important, but can we make a martyr saint of them? But here we have priests and local Christians who are not carrying weapons, who are standing firm, even in the case of their imminent death. Mm-hmm. One young Chinese was only 19 years old.
Mm-hmm. And I know too that in those last minutes in the church, the Boxers were shooting, and the Qing troops were shooting the Catholic faithful and trying to shoot the priests who were at the altar. Right? You mentioned that they were vested, and there were there was at least one Chinese saint in the church, Saint Mary Ju. What did she do at the last minute of her life?
Right, they found this out later through kind of oral testimonies, because you have to understand that the church is full of smoke. Many of those people go to their deaths. So where do we get the stories from? But it emerges later on through that there's a woman, Saint Mary Zieju Ju Wu, who basically takes a bullet for Father Maojian, that she stands up with her arms extended and basically, as Jesus says, lays down her life for her friends. That's how she dies. So that's clearly, I think, a martyr's death, to take a bullet for your missionary pastor or a priest. Mm-hmm. The second was Peter, St. Peter, again, same family name, Zieju, and he himself, he tries to escape at one point. Now, we don't know the situation, but get out of there, get out of Dodge, so to speak. And he goes to the sacristy. They're rounded up by imperial troops. And this is where we have this kind of very compelling story, is he's told to renounce his faith. And the idea was that the government officer sees something sort of intelligent, compelling, admirable about this young man, and says, look, you could have a long life ahead of you, or something to this effect. Just renounce your faith. Bu tui jiao, I will not renounce my faith. And he himself is killed as well. So again, clearly the marks of martyrdom.
You know, it's interesting. You mentioned this possible option for apostasy. Can you just say something about how it was that the government or Boxers would encourage people to renounce their faith? Is there an example of what they might have to do to formally denounce their faith in China during the Boxer Rebellion?
Well, to formally renounce your faith, there could be, you just have to say it, basically. In some cases, this goes back to even Japan, hundreds of years earlier, stepping on a crucifix or something like this. But a formal act where it's clear not only to the person, but to those around them that they are formally renouncing their faith. Just as those who would not renounce their faith, or those that remained firm, it would be very clear not only to themselves and to others that they were doing something very, very important for their faith.
So far we've talked about really two saints of Wuyi who died in their chapel in Wuyi, and we've discussed, of course, the four martyr saints who died in the village of Zhujiahe, and I think there were in all around 3,000 Catholics who were massacred in that village. It's the largest massacre of Christians in the history of China on the soil of the Middle Kingdom. And one of the things, we, as Tertullian said, the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church, and Pope John Paul II once said in a homily that the blood of St. Peter is the blood of the Church of Rome, and I think it's the blood of these martyrs that largely is the seed of the church in China. And we often think about, what did these martyrs build? I mean, what's the legacy? And in a sense, too, what can we take home from the lessons of these martyrs, and maybe from the lessons of the Jesuits? What message, what sense of hope, or what message has their witness given us today?
Right, I would say a couple of things. It seems like the official reports were that about 30,000 Christians went to their deaths in their Boxer Uprising between Catholics and Protestants. So this is a huge number. In addition, I would say that this area of southern Hebei province, to this day, while we may not be able to say this particular village that suffered martyrdom, intense massacre, is predominantly Catholic, I'm not sure. But the fact is that area is one of the most Catholic parts of China to this day. So it does seem that the blood of martyrs leads to the seeds of the church. For a kind of a take-home message, I would say that in looking at the lives, especially of these four particular European priests, I think that the word there is fidelity. Fidelity to our own Christian life, to our own mission in life, that none of them were, say, great China scholars, that none of them, I have many evidence, spoke, absolutely fluent Mandarin or had a lifelong desire to be in China. But at one point, they seemed to have this mission call to go to the missions generally. And in some cases, they struggled with that when they were actually there. Was this the right place? Then there seems to be a point with, yes, this is the right place. And I think for many of us, sometimes we may find a career change, we may find a different situation in which we're working, or in a different city, and we really are searching out the will of God, but He seems sometimes to write in crooked lines, right? Yeah. And the same for us, remain firm, remain faithful, and that God ultimately will reward our efforts.
That's a really strong and I think powerful message. And two, what really strikes me, you first mentioned St. Francis Xavier as really the father of the mission, and he was a Jesuit. And I'm thinking, so many centuries later, just recently you and I were in China, and you're a Jesuit. And it's a testimony, I think, to St. Francis Xavier's desire that the Jesuits missionize China, and St. Ignatius of Loyola's desire of missionizing the East, that just a month or two ago, I attended a Mass that you offered in the beautiful Basilica, Our Lady of the Seven Sorrows in Banshan in Shanxi Province, China. So I think the blood of the martyrs really is the seed of the Church, and I think that the Jesuits have been, and you know this as a historian, one of the strongest aspects of the Jesuit mission, of the mission in China. And two, I think just to remind the viewers that in a future episode, Father Mariani will appear again and talk about the modern church in China, the church in China that suffered through the 50s and the 1960s. But Father Mariani, thank you very much, and God bless you. Thank you.